Hello dolls and welcome back to another video. Today is June 12th of 2025 and it is currently about 2 p.m. and I'm telling you all of this because less than 24 hours ago it was made public that Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys had died. And it absolutely shook me. Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys were so influential for 1960s music. They're one of my favorite groups and I've always been very fascinated by Brian specifically, all of the Wilson brothers, but really Brian. This book that we're going to talk about, because there's a lot to unravel when it comes to this book, fell into my hands last year at my parents' house. My stepfather had bought it, I think sometime in the 90s, pretty soon after it was published. This is the German version of Wouldn't It Be Nice, a biography that has been highly discussed over the past decades, but I've read it and I don't know, it sparked a very deep fascination with the Beach Boys and Brian Wilson in particular. And so after I heard of his passing, I decided to spend basically the entire night and all of today to write him a video and dedicate him a piece, because he was such an influential and interesting man, and I really want to share his life story because I feel like he's a very misunderstood character. Not that I'm claiming that I'm gonna understand him fully, but I've tried to take everything that is known about him from the past decades. He's been in the spotlight for 60 years and just bring you a video all about Brian Wilson, his work, his life, his love, and everything that I felt like was important about him. So I would like to invite you to take a look at the life of a man who was so conflicted with himself, but who was also such a musical genius and who will live on in his songs forever. There was a time long ago when a shy boy from Hawthorne, California pressed a single key on his family piano and the whole world changed. His name was Brian Wilson, and from the quiet corners of his mind came symphonies of sand and sorrow, waves and wonder. He heard music the way most people dream. While the world spun louder and faster, Brian closed his eyes and built something softer, sadder, more beautiful. With trembling hands and a voice full of innocence, he gave the world harmony in a time of chaos. Now the sun has finally set on that boy by the sea. On June 11th of 2025, Brian Wilson passed away at the age of 82. But even as the world mourns, the music plays on. Golden and aching, drifting through car radios and open windows, still catching in the throat like memory. Because Brian didn't just soundtrack our summers, he helped us survive our winters. And somewhere in the distance, a falsetto still rises like a prayer. Chapter 1. Hawthorne Knights, Upbringing and Early Family Life. Brian Douglas Wilson was born into the blue Californian haze on June 20th of 1942, which means that in a little over a week he would have turned 83. He was born in Inglewood and then raised in nearby Hawthorne as the eldest brother, and with Dennis and Carl, he'd make music history. From the start, young Brian's world was both radiant and raw. Their father, Murry, once an aspiring songwriter himself, ruled the household with a violent fervor. Brian later recalled that when Murry didn't lash out physically, quote, he would take out his glass eye and make us look into the space where the eye used to be. Murry Wilson drove his sons toward musical success even as he haunted their childhood with fear. In this storm of abuse and dreams, Brian sought refuge in music and silence. He spent long hours by the piano creating melodies behind closed doors, in the family's tiny music room that he, quote, thought of as my kingdom, somewhere you could lock out the world. This sanctuary sheltered him as he suffered childhood injuries. A neighbor friend hit me with a lead pipe in the right side of my head, leaving him with only monophonic hearing, a loss he somewhat overcompensated later in his songs by these rich layers of music that he became so known for. From Hawthorne's foggy streets and within the four walls of his music room, Brian dreamed of far-off surf and stars, honing a fragile sensitivity on which his art would be built. Chapter 2. Brothers in Harmony, Musical Awakening. In the late 1950s, under the stern direction of their father Murry Wilson, the Wilson boys were guided, some might even say forced, into forming a band. Brian was about 16, Dennis 14, and Carl only 13. They were joined by their cousin Mike Love, who was about 18 in 1960. Young Brian had taught himself harmonies using a reel-to-reel recorder he received for his 16th birthday. He started by layering his voice with Carl's and then their mother's, but he soon recruited Mike and then later his childhood friend El Jardine to form the Pendletones in 1961. Brian co-wrote Surfin' with Mike Love. He later recalled, quote, "My dad stepped in and said, 'I'll be your manager.' Murry arranged the recording on Candix Records and later established their publishing company, Sea of Tunes, in 1962. All while micromanaging their lives and finances. Murry enforced daily rehearsals and harsh discipline. Some reports say he made them swallow raw fish or punished them with long bicycle rides when they slipped up, creating a pressure cooker that simultaneously tortured and disciplined them into musical precision. They changed their name from the Pendletones to the Beach Boys and laid the groundwork for a new kind of music. Chapter 3. Sunlit Ascent. The Beach Boys' Meteoric Rise. On the bright California horizon of the 1960s, Brian Wilson's songs took flight, capturing the spirit of a generation with radiant harmonies and sun-drenched themes. From their earliest hit Surfin' Safari in 1962 to classics like Surfin' USA, Fun Fun Fun, and California Girls, the Beach Boys quickly became the voice of California dreaming, racking up 36 top 40 hits and shaping what summer sounded like. Brian, then barely out of his teens, was the architect behind the magic. His genius wasn't just in songwriting. It was in arranging intricate harmonies, layering textures, and creating sounds that felt both nostalgic and visionary. As the National Desk eulogized, it was Brian's, quote, ethereal harmonies that became the band's lasting trademark, elevating simple pop songs into something almost symphonic. Behind the golden glow of their music, however, was a young man who remained inward and dreamy. He preferred the solitude of his bedroom, where he practiced self-recording to near-obsessive perfection. He immortalized his love for spending time in there in my favorite Beach Boys tune, In My Room. To me, this is the most gorgeous little love letter to a room and to the sacred place that your childhood bedroom really is. El Jardine later said, quote, Brian Wilson wasn't just the heart of the Beach Boys, he was the soul of our sound, adding, the melodies he dreamt up and the emotions he poured into every note changed the course of music forever. Their inner world, shaped by pressure and discipline, became the fertile ground where the Beach Boys sound bloomed, a harmony-driven language that defined the sunny optimism of the 1960s, even as deeper personal storms loomed beneath the surface. What the Beach Boys were creating wasn't just surf music, it was something newer, stranger, and more intricate. While early tracks like Surfin' Safari and Fun 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 rode the wave of Southern California surf culture, Brian infused them with layered harmonies, Chuck Berry-inspired guitar licks, and complex vocal arrangements drawn from his love of the Four Freshmen and George Gershwin. Unlike the raw rebellion of early rock or the polished teen pop of the late 1950s, this was sun-drenched escapism, filtered through a uniquely American dream. It resonated nationally, even with kids who'd never seen the ocean. As Brian later put it, quote, we made music for young people who felt things deeply but didn't know how to say it. The Beach Boys captured both the fantasy and fragility of youth, gleaming melodies making deeper emotional currents, a sound that, while rooted in its time, would lay the foundation for pop innovation in the decade to come. Tensions came to a head in early 1964 when Murray's domineering role became unbearable. He ran the band, controlled their lives like an army sergeant, and pushed them to their breaking point. During a tour of Australia, Murray fined the band escalating amounts of money for minor infractions. They had to pay him somewhere between $100 to even up to $1,000 for mistakes, like swearing or spending time with women. After this, the brothers finally voted to remove him from their management. Brian and Mike Love confronted Murray at their parents' home, and Brian later recalled shoving his father, sending the patriarch sprawling. Murray would not return to managing them, though he remained in their publishing until 1969. Carl reflected that firing Murry, quote, must have really crushed him. But for Brian, it was also bittersweet, freeing him to fully occupy the roles he'd spent years rehearsing for in private. Brian's quiet dominance had always simmered beneath the surface. While Dennis was the wild spirit and Carl the gentle technician, Brian was the visionary, the eldest brother, barely 21 at the band's breakthrough, with a deep well of musical intuition that far outpaced his years. Even early on, the others instinctively deferred to him when it came to melodies and arrangements. Brian didn't just hear songs, he saw them, layered and three-dimensionalized them, playing like orchestras in his mind. His intense sensitivity, what some called shyness, was really a hypersensitive genius at work, a gift that both set him apart and made him fragile. He studied Phil Spector's Wall of Sound like scripture, played the piano until his fingers ached, and spent hours perfecting harmonies no one else could quite hear yet. As Mike Love would later admit, quote, Brian was the leader, we just didn't realize how far ahead he was. Once Murry was out of the way, there was no question who would guide them next. With creative control firmly in Brian's hands, the Beach Boys' transition from a surf band to studio innovators began. His bedroom recorded harmonies and intense production standards, learned in that strict garage and bedroom environment, became the backbone of their ever-evolving sound. That childhood crucible of discipline and creativity became the engine behind their golden hits, and quite frankly behind Brian's entire career as a musical pioneer. Chapter 4. Pet Sounds and Smile, Creative Blossoming in Chaos. In December of 1964, Brian married his childhood sweetheart, Marilyn Ravel. She was only 16, and Brian had just turned 22. They had first met in 1962 at the Sunset Strip's Pandora's Box, where Brian had spilled hot cocoa on her blouse, and their laughter sparked a romance that inspired songs like All Summer Long and Don't Hurt My Little Sister. But the fairy tale had cracks. On a flight just weeks after their wedding, Brian endured a crippling panic attack that forced him off of tour and into seclusion, declaring that he would, quote, crack up any minute during the flight. His breakdown ultimately prompted the band to finish the tour without him. This withdrawal from the road allowed Brian to retreat fully into his music, working on Beach Boys Today, and set the stage for their most legendary record, Pet Sounds. His marriage to Marilyn was more than a personal milestone. It marked the beginning of his transformation from pop star to studio savant, as he balanced love with overwhelming pressure and the urgent need to create. By mid-1966, Brian had retreated from touring with the band to pour every ounce of his soul into the studio. The result was Pet Sounds, a masterpiece of pop imagination. As Reuters noted in their eulogy, Pet Sounds would come to be, quote, recognized as Wilson's magnum opus, inspiring the Beatles' Paul McCartney, who called it the blueprint for Sgt. Pepper. George Martin, the Beatles' famed producer, later said listening to Pet Sounds made him feel, quote, the kind of feeling that raises the hairs on the back of your neck. It's like falling in love. In these dreamy, lush chamber pop songs, Brian channeled both despair and hope, combining exotic instruments and complex chords with teenage poignancy. The world was transfixed by tracks like God Only Knows, a song of absolute devotion, and Wouldn't It Be Nice, a dreamy yearn for tomorrow. The Beach Boys sound became the soundtrack for an entire generation, yearning for a life in the California sun. It was a picture of dreamy nostalgia and new sounds, combined perfectly into catchy tunes that would soon be heard on the radio all over the world. But Pet Sounds also has a more serious undertone. In some of the songs, you can hear Brian's longing to transcend his troubles. It was in this creative crucible, coming off of the triumph of Pet Sounds, that Brian Wilson set his sight on something even more ambitious. Smile was meant to be a teenage symphony to God that would push the limits of pop music into the surreal. Collaborating with the eccentric and poetic lyricist Van Dyke Parks, Brian envisioned a sprawling masterpiece full of modular song fragments, experimental studio techniques, and American imagery, both mythical and strange. Tracks like Surf's Up, Cabin Essence, and Heroes and Villains glimmered with genius. But as 1966 turned into 1967, pressure began to mount and Brian began to unravel. Capitol Records was confused by the album's avant-garde direction. The other Beach Boys, especially Mike Love, questioned Van Dyke's opaque lyrics and Brian's increasingly erratic methods. Meanwhile, Brian was slipping into paranoia, spiritual obsession, and frequent LSD use. He spent days pacing barefoot around his house, building sandboxes in his living room and installing a tent in his dining room. Recording sessions grew chaotic and disjointed. Musicians remembered being called in to record single notes or spent hours harmonizing a fire bell. By spring of 1967, just as the Beatles were putting their final touches on Sgt. Pepper, Brian pulled the plug on Smile. The tapes were shelved and the dream dissolved. The Beach Boys moved on, pivoting to a simpler sound with albums like Smiley Smile and Wild Honey, but the creative magic was fractured. Brian began withdrawing from the band entirely, spending more and more time in bed. The same musical mind that had once layered harmonies like a symphonic cathedral was now silenced by depression, voices in his head, and a diet of pills and paranoia. His once commanding presence faded into the background as Carl Wilson quietly took over leadership. Marilyn, his young wife, struggled to keep their home life together, while the drugs, the illusions, and the downward spiral proved too much, and led to their eventual divorce in 1979. Chapter 5: Waves of Silence, Mental Health Battles. Amidst the worldwide success of the Beach Boys, Brian Wilson's inner world began to crack. As Fresh Air observed in 1998, he was, quote, once dismissed as a teenage surf guitar act, but then he had emerged as one of rock's, quote, most eccentric geniuses, plagued by depression, nervous breakdowns, and other psychological demons. As mentioned earlier, his first public collapse came in 1964 on a flight on tour. Overwhelmed, he stifled himself with a pillow and screamed that he was, quote, going out of his mind. Fellow bandmate Al Jardine later described how Brian cried, quote, every half hour on that trip, too shaken to perform. Forced to abandon live touring, he retreated entirely, sequestering himself in his bedroom turned studio, writing music in isolation. As said, I spoke about this earlier, and why it might not seem like that big of a deal or that dramatic of an incident, this was the beginning of what would have almost become the end of Brian Wilson's life. What followed was decades of mental anguish. By the 1970s, Brian suffered from persistent auditory hallucinations, something that he sort of quietly confirmed to NPR in 2016, saying, quote, I have auditory hallucinations, yes, I have had them now for about 50 years. These weren't gentle imaginations. They were voices shouting, your music is no damned good, you're falling behind, and even they're going to kill you. These demons tormented him daily. He described them as atrocious and said battling them became a non-stop war in his head. Diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder and sometimes bipolar, Brian also endured panic attacks, crippling paranoia, and deep depression. His brothers weren't untouched by this darkness. Dennis, in turn, struggled with impulsivity and substance addiction, his own echo of the family trauma. Carl and Mike Love confided that they grew wary of Brian's isolation, worried he'd disappear into his own mind. Brian often hid these battles behind a thin veil of normalcy. He told people he wrote songs to escape, saying, quote, when I walk into the studio, music happens and the voices stop happening. Still, the hallucinations persisted. In 2006, he admitted, quote, for the past 40 years, I've had auditory hallucinations. Every few minutes, the voices say something derogatory to me. It's like a fight. On stage, even later on, he would cover his ears or sidestep singing, trying to drown them out. In 2019, he postponed a tour due to mental insecurities, again citing the voices. Through it all, Brian remained acutely self-aware. He once told The Guardian that his struggles were rooted in childhood abuse, saying, the sadness came from me, came from my heart. And yet he never stopped creating. Songs like I Just Wasn't Made for These Times and Caroline No became elegies to his fragile mind, floating between worlds of longing and loss. Even when doctors encouraged institutionalization, Brian resisted, believing that creativity and chaos coexisted. Chapter 6: Under Lys Shadow, the Controversial Therapist. In the mid-1970s, Murry Wilson's twin battles with depression and drug addiction hit a dangerous low. His marriage to Marilyn was unraveling and his public persona fragmented. He'd overdosed, wandered barefoot through parks, and collapsed into catatonic states. In desperation, Marilyn hired Dr. Eugene Landy in 1975, a psychologist with radical methods, 24-hour therapy, strict diets, and constant supervision. And in the beginning, everything seemed so promising. Early signs looked hopeful. Landy offered structure and coaxed creative sparks to life, famously dangling a cheeseburger to encourage Brian to write a song. But soon, Landy's control became more chilling than caring. According to multiple biographies, Landy was charging enormous fees, reportedly up to $20,000 a month. He was demanding full control over Brian's life and displaying increasingly aggressive, controlling behavior. Soon Marilyn and the Beach Boys management began to feel that Landy was doing more harm than good, inserting himself into Brian's creative and financial affairs. So in 1976, just about a year after he was first hired, he was dismissed. Although his 24-hour therapy approach initially showed results, helping Brian lose weight, become more active, and even engage in some songwriting, his methods quickly alarmed the Wilson family and associates. He was overly controlling, and Brian did whatever he was told, fully under Landy's spell. After Landy's dismissal, Brian spiraled again, retreating into substance abuse and erratic behavior. He drifted through a fog of inertia and dependence. In those intervening years, he spent much of his time holed up in his Bel Air mansion, compulsively exercising, sleeping excessively, overeating, and descending deeper into drug use, turning particularly to cocaine and alcohol. His daughters Carney and Wendy, still young at the time, recall a distant and erratic father, often locked away in his bedroom, disconnected from their lives. As Carney later revealed in an interview, their home was chaotic, quote, "There were parties going on downstairs and Dad was upstairs, with the drapes drawn, talking to himself." The family tried to intervene, but Brian's disorientation made it nearly impossible. While Marilyn struggled to hold things together, her younger sister Candy, a gentle, steady presence, became one of the few people Brian still confided him every now and then. But even she couldn't reach him fully. This was a lost chapter, a blur of paranoia, retreat, and weight gain, when Brian's genius dimmed and the family feared he might have never returned to music or even survive. It was in this dangerous state, when things had worsened to a point of despair, that Marilyn and others reluctantly brought Landy back. It was 1983, and this time Landy was hired under a formal legal contract. Brian was now living as Landy's patient mobile and roommate assistant profit center, all wrapped into one. Landy lived at Brian's house, padlocked the fridge to enforce strict weight loss, tightly controlled his diet, dictated his social and creative life, and notoriously banned him from almost all contact with his family. Under Dr. Landy's direction, Brian's first solo album, 1988's Murry Wilson, billed him as the co-writer on many tracks, and although the album barely reached top 40 on Billboard, it was something his family and press saw as the blurring of therapy into control. The situation worsened when Landy secured 25% of Brian's publishing royalties in exchange for continuing credit and influence. And then a landmark moment came in 1991, when Wouldn't It Be Nice, My Own Story was published. It was ghostwritten in large part by Dr. Landy, with Brian later claiming he hadn't even read the manuscript. The book's inscription reads, "To Dr. Eugene Landy, without you, there'd be no music." It hit shelves in October of 1991, and it quickly stirred the waters. Sales spiked, but so did skepticism. Despite strong initial sales, the memoir faced sharp criticism. The New York Times called it a, quote, "express train to hell and back," noting its vivid portrayal of Brian's collapse and comeback, but also the uncanny tone as an unsolicited ode to Dr. Landy. Rolling Stone's columnist David Felton even called it, quote, "a slick parody," quoting the line, "Brian was never all Brian. Now the Landy half has taken over, probably for all time." The the publication triggered a cascade of liberal lawsuits from family members, including Carl and his mother Audrey Wilson and Mike Love, all pointing to what they saw as a Landy-centric, sanitized version of Brian's life. Mike Love famously denounced the memoir as, quote, absolute bullshit, adding under oath that some of its stories were, quote, all garbage. Critics accused the book of plagiarizing earlier biographies, particularly lifting passages while repackaging them in Brian's voice. Still, sales remained solid, indication that despite the controversy, readers were captivated by the true crime-style confession of a musical legend in crisis. Looking back, Brian's feelings about the book were conflicted. He has disowned it, admitting under oath that he barely read it and felt truly misrepresented. In 2016, he released I Am Brian Wilson, which he wrote with Ben Greenman, a memoir he felt like painted a more authentic picture of him and the one that he considers his actual biography. In its pages, he calls the earlier memoir a book that didn't really feel like me, saying it felt influenced by others, rather than spoken from his own voice. Yet, Wouldn't It Be Nice remains a piece of his own story, not so much the book itself, but more the circumstances under which it was written that make it so truly intriguing. As said, I read this book kind of like going in blind, so I had no idea what I was going into. I had no idea about the whole Dr. Landy situation. But what really fascinated me and what really stood out in this book to me was the way that he's very open about his struggles, but the way that he speaks about Dr. Landy, he puts him on this pedestal, like he saved his life, and maybe he felt like that back then, but I feel like you can feel in the book that he didn't write that. It's just a weird way of saying things. It's a weird way of phrasing pieces. And what I found interesting is, because I have listened to so much of the Beach Boys growing up, that it didn't felt like his tone. It didn't felt like his way of writing at all. I read the German version. However, I then went and reread parts that I could find online in English, because I was like, is this a translation issue? But it isn't. And I think it is very clearly, you can hear that someone else clearly wrote this book. I would still recommend this to any Brian Wilson fan, because it's such an absurd book, and it also does have great pictures, which is always lovely. However, I feel like the way that he speaks about his family in parts of it really shows you what Dr. Landy was doing by isolating him, because it puts out this picture of the Beach Boys that I feel like isn't authentic to who they were. I've read several other biographies, like for example the 2015 one, and the way that he speaks about the band there and his family is very, very different. And I just feel like Dr. Landy was trying to get him away, but he was also obviously trying to profit off of him. Who else would have been able to pay $20,000 in the 70s? And it just bugs me so much, because whenever I come across someone going and seeking therapy in the 70s, 60s, 80s, which was really hard. The first time that I ever kind of came in touch with that topic was when I did research on Edie Sedgwick, and then I read a book called Lead Sister about Karen Carpenter, where this is also a theme. And these therapists take so much money from these people who are in such a state of desperation that they're willing to do everything, and it breaks my heart. And I think it is sickening how someone who's supposed to help you, I have been through several years of therapy. I was in a hospital at some point because I struggled really bad with bulimia and anorexia and depression and panic attacks and all of that too. And I am lucky that I have healthcare and that I was always with people who truly, I believe, tried to help me to the best of their capacities. And they didn't take my money, and they just really, they really tried to help me without taking advantage of my situation. And I think that that is what infuriates me so much about this whole Dr. Landy situation. There are several clips of him online with Brian Wilson, because obviously he stepped into the spotlight. He was like, I'm kind of like his other half now. It's very, very eerie. And I would just encourage you to watch a couple of them, because they're weird, and you can tell by the way that Brian moves and just kind of The way that he is in those videos shows you how much under Dr. Landy's spell he actually was. But Wouldn't It Be Nice was also the final straw because it confirmed what the family had feared, that Dr. Landy had overstepped the boundaries of therapy and was now controlling Brian's public identity as well as his private life. A protracted court struggle followed. In 1992, California regulators stripped Dr. Landy of his license, and a judge banned him from having any further contact with Brian. Brian, in hindsight, acknowledged the complexity of the situation. Quote, "He saved my life," he admitted, but also branded Dr. Landy as manipulative and overwhelming in an unsettling way. The ordeal cost him autonomy and left emotional scars, but it also marked his turning point. For the first time in years, Brian was free to reclaim his music, his relationships, and perhaps most importantly, his voice. Chapter 7, Sunrise and Solos, Recovery and Rebirth. After years in the grip of Dr. Landy's iron fist care, Brian Wilson finally emerged, blinking into the morning light. The turning point came unexpectedly at a Cadillac dealership in Los Angeles. It was 1986, and Brian, still under Landy's control, wandered into the showroom, dazed and subdued. Behind the desk sat Melinda Ledbetter, a sharp and compassionate saleswoman who recognized the flickering brilliance beneath his awkward demeanor. She sold him a car, but most importantly, they stayed in touch. Although Dr. Landy intervened and cut them off for years, Melinda never forgot Brian. After Landy was removed in 1992, she re-entered Brian's life and slowly became his anchor. In 1995, they got married. "She saved me," Brian has often said. Melinda brought not only stability and advocacy, later serving as his manager and fiercest protector. With her encouragement, Brian stepped back into the world, this time on his own terms. For the first time in decades, he performed as Brian Wilson, not as a figurehead in a band he no longer controlled. Nervous at first, he quickly found comfort in the applause. "I feel pretty good," he said during a Fresh Air interview in 2016, reflecting on his Pet Sounds 50th anniversary tour. "We've been having a great tour. We're doing the Pet Sounds album on stage. The people love it. They just love it." That audience love helped him reclaim a vital truth. The music never left him. In 1998, he released Imagination, his first album of original material in over a decade. Critics were mixed, but for longtime fans, the album was a quiet miracle, and it was proof that Brian's voice, though older and more fragile, still carried the warmth of youth and yearning. And slowly, steadily, he kept going. Albums followed, Getting In Over My Head in 2004, That Lucky Old Sun in 2008, and No Peer Pressure in 2015. His songwriting, once frantic and fueled by fear, became gentler, introspective, and unhurried. But the true ghost of his past lingered. Remember Smile? The brilliant, aborted symphony he had once called his teenage symphony to God? For decades, it had remained a symbol of collapse, shelved in 1967 after Brian's mental health shattered under the pressure. Bootlegs circulated, fan theories flourished, but for Brian, Smile was not just an unfinished record. It was a wound. "It scared me," he later admitted. "I didn't want to go back there." Still, something shifted in the early 2000s. With Melinda's support and a strong new backing band, including musical director Darian Sahanaja, Brian began to revisit the long-buried sessions. He reunited with lyricist Van Dyke Parks. Piece by piece, they reconstructed the music, modular melodies, whimsical lyrics, moments of pure harmonic bliss, until Smile came back to life. It was, as one journalist put it, like watching a man put his own broken soul back together in public. In 2004, Brian Wilson Presents Smile debuted live at the Royal Festival Hall in London. When Brian sang those opening lines, "Our prayer is a world of peace," many in the audience wept. Here was a man who had been written off, paraded around, medicated, silenced. Now he was finally being heard, fully and completely on his own terms. The studio version of Smile was released to critical acclaim. Rolling Stones called it the most famous unfinished album in rock history, finally realized. In 2011, the original Beach Boys' Smile sessions were officially released, earning Brian a Grammy for Best Historical Album. That Grammy, placed in his hands nearly 50 years after the breakdown that derailed it all, was more than just an award. It was validation, a quiet but resounding message from the world. We believe you now. We hear it too. Chapter 8. The Music Never Left. The Beach Boys were born of brotherhood, but not spared by it. Beneath the sunshine harmonies and California dreams lay a family saga steeped in trauma, rivalry, and fragile grace. Dennis, the wild heartbeat of the group, drowned in alcoholism before he drowned in the Marina del Rey harbor in 1983, just days after being barred from living on his beloved boat. He was 39. Carl, the gentle anchor and youngest Wilson brother, carried the band's torch through the tumultuous 70s and 80s, holding the pieces together with a quiet strength. But even Carl, steady, soulful Carl, battled depression and died of lung cancer in 1998. He was only 51. The Wilson brothers, Brian, Dennis, and Carl, were bound by blood, music, and pain. They circled one another for decades like wounded planets, brilliant and burning. Their harmonies were otherworldly, but their lives were often discordant. "We were a family, but we were also a storm," Carl once said. "We loved each other, we hurt each other, but the music was always the best of us." They shared moments of tenderness and long stretches of silence. Dennis, the middle brother and rebel, often clashed with Brian but defended his genius fiercely. "Brian is the Beach Boys," Dennis famously said in 1976. "We're his messengers. He's all of it, period." Carl, ever the diplomat, played mediator and peacekeeper. Brian, haunted and reclusive, floated in and out of their orbit, his brilliance often eclipsed by his suffering. What held them together when everything else fell apart was the music. It was both salvation and curse, the golden thread that tied their childhood dreams to adult realities. They built something immortal together, even as it nearly destroyed them. In the end, they were a family, not just of biology, but of sound, a trinity of trauma and talent that changed the shape of American music forever. Through it all, Brian endured. His story wasn't just about music. It was about survival. A boy who once built sonic cathedrals in a suburban bedroom, he became a man torn between the angels in his head and the demons at his door. At his lowest, he drifted through fog and fear, medicated and manipulated, his genius nearly silenced. But when the tide finally turned, something astonishing happened. He began to heal. Slowly, unevenly, but unmistakably. In the later years of his life, the world met a different Brian, older, fragile, but present. He started performing under his own name, tentatively at first. Then something clicked. Audiences still loved him, his voice cracked, but the spirit soared. Brian's life came full circle. As time passed, his legacy settled into the golden light across generations. Fellow musicians never stopped singing his praises. John Stamos called him someone who, quote, felt things deeper than most of us ever will. Paul McCartney said Pet Sounds changed the way he thought about songwriting. Rolling Stones named it the second greatest rock album of all time, behind only Sgt. Pepper. The Beach Boys themselves summed it up best. Brian Wilson wasn't just the heart of the Beach Boys, he was the soul of our sound. His melodies, God Only Knows, California Girls, Don't Worry Baby, became cultural DNA. They echoed in films, commercials, teenage bedrooms, and late-night drives. They were lullabies and anthems, stitched into the lives of millions. Through his music, Brian taught us something eternal. That beauty can emerge from the darkest places, and that harmony, no matter how fleeting, is always worth chasing. Even Brian seemed to know this. Music is God's voice, he once said, and through him, that voice reached millions. Into the 2020s, he could still be found at the piano, drifting into those same sweet chord changes he first imagined in Hawthorne. His concerts, whether he was performing Pet Sounds, Smile, or songs from across his long, tangled journey, became sacred spaces. People came to cry, to remember, to heal. His voice was shakier now, but the music was still the same. Yesterday, on June 11th of 2025, the world lost Brian Wilson. He passed away at age 82. His family shared the news on his official Instagram, requesting privacy while acknowledging, quote, "Our beloved father, Brian Wilson, has passed away. We are at a loss for words. No official cause of death was disclosed. He had been living under conservatorship since early 2024 due to an advanced neurocognitive disorder following the passing of his beloved wife, Melinda Ledbetter, in 2024. The outpouring of grief was both immediate and extraordinary. John Cusack, who memorably played him in Love and Mercy, wrote, quote, "The maestro has passed. The man was an open heart with two legs, with an ear that heard the angels." Elton John, calling him a musical genius, credited Brian as, quote, "the biggest influence on my songwriting." Other giants, including Ringo Starr, Bob Dylan, Carole King, Keith Richards, Mick Fleetwood, Nancy Sinatra, and Questlove, all honored him in their heartfelt tributes. In performance venues and all over social media, fans and musicians alike gathered to celebrate his vast legacy. Sting even paid homage, performing God Only Knows during a live show in Germany last night. But of course, the two remaining Beach Boys, the ones that were there all his life, didn't stay silent either. I want to read you their full posts because they're so truly heartbreaking, and they just sum Brian Wilson up as the bandmate, confidant, and friend that he was to them all their life. El Jardine posted this picture, and I'm just going to put that up here, and he wrote, "Brian Wilson, my friend, my classmate, my football teammate, my Beach Boy bandmate, and my brother in spirit. I will always feel blessed that you were in our lives for as long as you were. I think the most comforting thought right now is that you are reunited with Carl and Dennis, singing those beautiful harmonies again. You were a humble giant who always made me laugh, and we will celebrate your music forever. Brian, I'll really miss you. Still, I have the warmth of the sun." Mike Love shared a video with footage of Brian and the two of them over the years, and he wrote, "Today, the world lost a genius, and I lost a cousin by blood and my partner in music. Brian Wilson wasn't just the heart of the Beach Boys. He was the soul of our sound. From the first time we sang together as kids in my living room, I knew there was something otherworldly in him. His musical gifts were unmatched. The melodies he dreamt up, the emotions he poured into every note. Brian changed the course of music forever. Our journey together was filled with moments of brilliance, heartbreak, laughter, complexity, and most of all, love. Like all families, we had our ups and downs, but through it all, we never stopped loving each other, and I never stopped being in awe of what he could do when he sat at the piano, or his spontaneity in the studio. Brian's unique artistry and our collaboration gave the world the American dream of optimism, joy, and a sense of freedom. Music that made people feel good, made them believe in an endless summer and endless possibilities. It was one of the greatest blessings of my life to experience that creative space with him. It was our privilege to make the world believe in sunshine, surfing, and teenage dreams. My life was forever changed by Pet Sounds, God Only Knows, In My Room, Good Vibrations, The Warmth of the Sun, and 100 other pieces of his soul wrapped in music. He allowed us to show the world what vulnerability and brilliance sound like in harmony. He was fragile, he was intense, he was funny, and he was one of a kind. My wife, Jacqueline, and I are heartbroken. She stood beside me through so many chapters of this story, and we both send our love and prayers to Brian's family, his children, and all who were touched by his life and gifts. Brian, you once asked, wouldn't it be nice if we were older? May you rest in the peace you so deeply deserve, surrounded by the heavenly music you helped create. May your spirit soar as high as your falsetto, may your wings spread in effortless flight. Thank you for the harmonies, the memories, and the love. Death leaves a heartache no one can heal. Love leaves a memory no one can steal. I'll miss you forever, my beloved cousin, Mike. Oh, this is too much for me today. I wanted to make this video. This is like a little personal thing here before we wrap this up, but in my circle, in my life, several people have died over the past couple of weeks, and it's been quite hard because it's been a while. Like, it's been a couple of years since someone has died, and now several people quite close to me died in different age categories, and it's just, I don't know. Sometimes it's just heartbreaking to know that people are gone. But the way that they spoke about him, his bandmates, and his friends, just shows you the kind of person that he was. And I'm so glad that he made it so long through his life, because the story of the Wilson brothers is so tragic, and it seemed like at least one of them got a happy ending. As the world said goodbye, the sentiment was unanimous. Brian Wilson didn't just write melodies, he shaped the emotional language of pop music. In his passing, we lose a genius, but his songs will continue to wash over us, like the waves on the California shore he helped define. I still hear music in my head, he once said, and maybe that's the miracle. After everything, the breakdowns, the betrayals, the years of silence, Brian Wilson never lost the music. It waited for him like the tide, and when it returned, it carried him home. So that is it for today's video. That is it for my tribute to the incredible Brian Wilson. His story touched me so deeply. Whenever I researched parts of it and read the book and everything, it's just, there's something about the story of the Wilson brothers, as said, that is so heartbreaking, and it's almost, it feels like a good thought knowing that they're reunited in a sense now, but his death made me realize how long it had been since his brothers passed, which just is so heartbreaking too. And the Beach Boys are one of my all-time favorite bands. I think they're greatly underestimated, and they shaped so much of pop and rock music, not only of the time, but just in general, and made me sad that they never got to grow old together, I guess. But yeah, that is it. That is my little tribute to the wonderful Brian Wilson. I don't know what else I have to say. Maybe some of you would like to share your stories about Brian Wilson, or the music that you associate with him, the feelings. I feel like for a lot of people, this music was part of their childhood. For me, it truly was. And the Beach Boys is probably one of my son's favorite bands. He loves them. It's such upbeat, wonderful music. We love to dance around to them. And yeah, it's just sad. It's just really heartbreaking. Also goes to show you how illnesses and mental illnesses can run and ruin a family. There is so much more to Brian Wilson's life and work, and as always, I'm gonna link all the sources down below, all the books, all the biographies, all the documentaries, and I truly cannot encourage you enough to watch and read those and just take a look into the world of the Beach Boys, because there's a lot there, but what I would like him to be remembered for is the way that he never gave up, the way that he never lost the music, and the way that he came back as himself. Because I think that that is something so rare and so beautiful. But yeah, that is it for today's video. That is all I have. If you enjoyed the video, I would love you to give it a thumbs up, maybe even share it with a friend. Keep his memory alive. If you're interested in the 60s and 70s in general, consider subscribing. My videos are usually not that sad. This one just kind of like hit close to me. And after I heard of his passing, I had this feeling inside of me that I needed to write down all my thoughts, feelings, and write this video and put it out there for all of you and for all of us to mourn together in a sense, I guess. But yeah, consider subscribing if you're just interested in the 60s and 70s in general. I would love to have you around. I hope you have a beautiful day. Go out, enjoy the sunshine. Maybe you can stop by a beach today. Take yourself some time to focus on you and your mental health today, especially after hearing this story. It is so important to just take good care of yourself. And I will catch you in the next video. Bye, dolls.